All right, good people. So we started off our journey getting into the React world by creating our first React application. And we did that by way of using the Create React app toolchain. For those of y'all who might not be familiar with it, React is a JavaScript library that allows for us to create front-end applications in JavaScript. And so in order to work with React, there's a number of ways that you can work with React. You can either add it to an existing project or create an entirely new project in React. And we were going the second route. So we're just creating new projects in React and starting to work with them. And in order to do that, we needed to get the React toolchain that allows for us to create our first React applications. So the toolchain that we're using is the Create React App toolchain, which is the toolchain that most often than not for folks who are just doing development work with React are using. That toolchain requires you to install Node on your machine, but once you install Node on your machine, then you can run a specific command called Create React App that allows for you to create React projects. So when we created our first React project, we did something similar to this, where after installing Node, we were able to run this command npx create React app, and then I think I called that app like my first React app or something like that. And what this did, as we saw in the last session, right, it did a long script process where it did a number of different commands on our behalf, as well as created our first folder structure and file structure for our React project. If you were around and you remember what I'm talking about, just give me a thumbs up so I know that we're all on the same page and kind of remember what we're talking about here. Dope. Plug my computer in real quick. So the Create React App toolchain is when you start off your React projects, that's how you're going to start them. Is you're going to use the Create React App toolchain to start your projects. What gets created as a result of the Create React App toolchain is this really comprehensive file structure that has a number of files that allow for us to launch a React application on a local server and make changes to it as we see fit, right? So we started walking through some of those files and folders and whatnot that come back within the Create React App toolchain. And now I think my goal is to start talking about how do we actually start writing React code? What's the JavaScript that we need to know in order to continue to write different React code? 1 second, yo. Sorry. So essentially, we talked through the first main files in the React application, and I told you that the two most important files are the JavaScript files that come back within our source directory within the project, right? So within the source directory, we have two JavaScript files that are really important, the app.js and then the index.js. In the index.js, we see this bit of code that does some interesting JavaScript, right? Importing a lot of different things at the top here. And then we see that it is creating a new, it's using some JavaScript to create a new element within our HTML. And we talked a little bit about this in the last session where we mentioned that React is still working similar to how regular HTML and JavaScript pages work, which is, hey, there's an HTML document, and then that document is being manipulated by JavaScript. So we can do things like, hey, document get element by ID, and we're working with the DOM. But React adds this extra layer on top of the DOM to allow for us to use JavaScript to interact with the DOM more fluidly. And that layer in between our JavaScript and the HTML is called the React DOM. So our index.js is responsible for creating that React DOM and essentially managing the connection between our JavaScript files that we write and the HTML that the end user is going to see, right? And how React does this is by way of creating components of code that get rendered onto the screen, onto the DOM, onto the virtual DOM, the React DOM. So essentially what this file is doing is creating that connection between React and our HTML document, and then rendering components onto that particular HTML document using the React DOM and some of the complex functionality that it has to turn our JavaScript into HTML that the end user is going to see. And so if I just, so remember when you create your React app, it creates this entire project folder for you. So you have to go into that project folder. One way is to do it through the terminal and, just kind of change directories until you get into the, that directory, or you can do like I did here, which is just open that project up in VS Code and open the terminal in VS Code, because the terminal in VS Code will take you directly to that project in the terminal. So sometimes I like to do open my projects in VS Code just because I can get instant access to that directory. The other way is to open my terminal and try to find the path for that particular directory myself, right? Navigate through the terminal to find the folder. But once I'm here, right, I can run the command npm start to start the local development server, which will allow for me to see this application running in a local development server in my browser here. So once the server kind of boots up and loads, it normally opens a new tab in whatever is the last browser window that you have open, and allows for you to kind of see the changes in the project changing live, right? Whoops. So yeah, let me just do this. The cool thing about the React Create React App library is it builds all of these things for us, right? We don't need to do anything extra to create our server, to launch anything. We just can use these scripts to start these local servers ourselves, right? So here's some of the last changes that we made on that last session, on that first Create React App template. If you started a Create React App project recently, you'll notice that this is still using a lot of the same elements that were originally kind of defaulted in here, but we started adding some other things like this H1 and some paragraph text and things of that nature. So you might be wondering, okay, well, this index.js is doing what you said, creating a connection to the HTML and then rendering some components, right? Well, where's all the visual stuff taking place? And that's what's going on with this app component that we created. This app component, if you recall, is where all of our visual elements are being created in JavaScript and then turned into HTML in the HTML document that we linked to in the index.js. So the app.js is another important file within the React, within your React projects, Create React App projects, that is responsible for managing all of the visual elements that you're going to create, right? So the app.js is the first component that gets created in Create React App projects. So we're going to talk a little bit more today about what that means, like what is a component and like how do we create one and those types of things. But it's important to know that the first component that gets rendered on a default Create React App build is the app.js. So anything that you put that you want to see typically has to be put into the app.js or in another component that will be rendered in the app.js. And we'll see that example of that in a little bit. But I want to kind of take a second before we dive into making new components and getting into the weeds of that to just talk through some of what we're seeing is going on in the JavaScript that is happening in these two files, because some of y'all might not be familiar with JavaScript. This might be your first time working with that language. So there's definitely language-based nuances that are important to know and keep in mind as you're starting to write JavaScript for the purposes of working within React, right? So to go into the index.js, we're going to kind of look through these two files first and just talk through what's going on in here. And then we'll extend it into some other files as we create them. So some of the most important things that are going on in this file from a JavaScript perspective are, one, importing from other files and from other packages, right? So JavaScript, like most languages, has access to a new, like, one, we can create different packages or folders of code, right? Bundled code that we might want to bring in from one project to another project. In different languages, in different programming environments, that process is handled differently. But what we're doing here at the top from lines 1 to 5 are importing specific JavaScript or importing specific files into this file that we're working with in this index.js. So the ones you see here, my VS Code marks them as blue. These are packages, JavaScript packages that are being imported into this index.js. What that import basically is saying, hey, I want the functions or the data that is inside of this package. I want to be able to refer to it with these names and use them, use the methods, use the functions, use the, whatever data is specified in those files. I want to be able to use it within these files. So as you can see, we imported React from React, and the default syntax for importing from within these types of projects is using import blank from blank, right? So import the name of the package from the package, the actual package name that was installed, right? So here you have opportunity to name this. So we named this React so that we can refer to it as React and get different classes, different functions, access to the different data that's stored within that file, right? So we're importing those libraries and packages in, and you can also see that we can also do certain things like import specific files. So in this case, we wanted to get access to the index.css. And in order to create a connection between the JavaScript file and any corresponding CSS elements within React, all you have to do is just import the specific CSS file that you want those particular components or elements to conform to within that particular file. So you'll see sometimes that people are importing a CSS file similar like this. And what this does is it just puts the CSS that's written in this file, puts any changes that CSS specifies into the components that are written out inside of this particular file. So we'll talk a lot more about styling and React and styling in a couple of sessions, but just important to note that what's going on here, one big thing that's going on here is we're importing data from one file to another file. You might be wondering, well, where are these files coming from? Where are these packages, as we call them, coming from? These packages are installed when we first create React App, when we first run Create React App. So if you remember, Create React App first builds a number of packages. It installs and builds a number of packages for us. And those packages, as we mentioned in our last session, are stored in this node modules folder that contains a number of different packages, and then the packages that those packages needed in our project, right? So if we scroll down a long time till we get to the R's, you will see that, whoops, I passed them because I scrolled like the Hulk real quick. But you'll see that, the React package is here, right? So when we say import React from React, we're actually saying import like the main bit of data from this library React, which is coming back actually from this index.js file inside of that package. So importing and exporting are a huge part of the JavaScript that comes up within working with React. And so we always will start off our React files with importing from the React library or importing from other packages that we needed to install so that we can get access to certain methods and other JavaScript that is necessary for what we're trying to accomplish. And then similarly, we will import certain files like CSS files particularly into our JavaScript files where we're going to want styling applied. And so The most simple example of this in a way that I think will help y'all understand this is when we're working with components, right? And so clearly we have two files here, the app.js and the index.js. And I said the app.js was the file responsible for defining our visual elements. Hopefully you see that, right? Just by way of looking at what's inside of these files. The app.js has a specific syntax at the end that says export default app, right? What this line is doing is the second part of how imports and exports work within JavaScript, right? So in order for something to be imported, it has to have been exported from its original file as what we call a module. And so what's going on in this app.js at the end is we're exporting the app function that we created, right? And we'll go into the app.js more detailed in a second, but essentially the app.js is just one function, right? If I close it, and we wrote that function and now we're exporting it. And the default here is essentially saying that if somebody were to import from this file, the default module that they will be returned will be this one, right? So and if they don't specify a particular thing they want to import, this will be the thing that is default imported on this file's behalf, right? So if we go back to the index.js and we say, hey, import app from /app, right? Well, this is saying, hey, import this function app that we just exported from that particular file. And so that's how we're able to now make a reference to that same, to this app as almost like a variable of sorts, right? And then use it in our own file here, right? And essentially what the index.js was doing was saying, hey, take that component that we exported and let's use it inside here, particularly for this function on line 8 that renders that component into our HTML document, right? So imports and exports are one of the most important things to kind of get familiar with within JavaScript when you are looking at files, especially the default files in Create React App. So that's what's going on here at the first couple lines. The second line that's important really is this one, line 7, where we're creating a variable, right? And so we talked a little bit about some of this early JavaScript stuff, like creating variables. I told you that there's two variable declaration keywords that we use. One is the const keyword and the other is the let keyword. So we see let, and, you know, sometimes if you were to create another variable, like, you know, say let name, and put like cam or something, right? So in this case, right, on these two lines now, I'm creating variables in JavaScript. One is a very simple variable, which is just a string, and then the other is a little bit more complicated, but hopefully you see that, you know, that the syntax is still the same, right? We use a variable declaration keyword that allows for us to define the mutability of that variable. So const variables are like constant values, so they don't typically change. They don't change really at all. You can't change the data within a constant value, right? It stays the same. A let keyword also creates a variable, but those variables can be changed. And so the difference between like the let and the const keyword would just be, can the data be changed within what's being saved here, right? So, you know, this wasn't here, but I'm just kind of making the point. We're creating a variable here, right? This variable is called root. And so one thing you might notice about JavaScript, and some of y'all mentioned last time we were talking about this, is JavaScript doesn't by default do any type handling, right? So at the end of the day, all of the variables that you create in JavaScript just need to have a variable name. And JavaScript will allow for you to set anything to this particular variable just with the name, right? So const tells you that this variable, the data itself can't be changed, but it has nothing to do with, hey, is this an integer? Hey, is this a string? Hey, is this a whatever, right? In fact, it's kind of hard to look at this line and say, what is the type of element that's going to be returned here, right? It's not really a string. Is it a string? Is it a Boolean? Like, we don't really know, right? And unlike other programming languages, JavaScript is not very specific about types. So you don't ever see something like const, you know, int root equals, you know what I'm saying? Like that's how tightly typed languages are normally kind of structured, where you have to specify, hey, this is an integer or whatever. But in JavaScript, you don't do that. So just what we see here is the fact that we're creating variables, and you'll be creating variables often to save your data in JavaScript or to refer to data in JavaScript. And it's just important to know that you don't put a type with that declaration. The React DOM create root file. Actually, when you hover over it, it'll show you some of like what's going on in there. But it looks like it is. So it looks like this function is just taking in some things and returning some. It's just essentially creating a new root for the React DOM, right? So that it's not really easy to say like what type is this, but JavaScript refers to different pieces of data as what we call objects. And an object can best be thought of almost like a class, like how y'all might, if y'all have ever studied any object-oriented programming languages, you have classes, and classes create objects, and those objects have methods or have properties that you can access using the dot syntax, right? Objects in JavaScript are very much the same. An object in JavaScript would kind of just look like something like this. So let's say I create a user, and the user, like I have a variable called user. If I were to create this as an object, it would just kind of look something like this, where that particular variable now is an object that has access to key value pairs of data, right? So something I might expect all users to have is like a user ID, right? And that user ID might be like some long, kind of string and alphanumeric set of things, right? But it also might have like a username, right? And it also might have just come, let's say like signed up, could have a Boolean value, etc. Right? So this is simple primitive data that we're probably all used to, right? Strings and Booleans and whatnot. But what's interesting about JavaScript objects is that they can also handle having data of a number of different varieties as well, right? So one that you might be interested in is like, oh, maybe like a user has friends, right? And we inside of that user, we have an array of like other user ID friends that are part of this user's posse or something, right? So I'm just typing some gibberish, but maybe we have a couple of strings in here with like just different like user IDs of some kind, right? So clearly we can create arrays and use arrays as data that are also passed within objects, right? Something that is surprising to most people, but is also able to be done within JavaScript objects is you can pass functions as data within a JavaScript object as well. So sign in might be another property within this user, right? And that sign in might just be a function that does something specific, like console.log, like signed in, right? So this is kind of funky, right? For people who have never worked with JavaScript before, to be able to be like, oh, well, so this is data, but it can, it's kind of like a dictionary in some other languages. If you've worked with dictionaries before, where basically the thing that makes an object unique is that it key value pairs. So every value of the data has a corresponding key. And if I want to ever refer to those that data, I can always do something like this, like user, and then refer to that data with the dot syntax, right? So the dot would say, hey, inside of this object is some data that I want to refer to with its key, right? So if I want the user ID, I can grab it like this. If I wanted to run that function, that sign-in function, right, I could do something like this, right? And run that particular function, right? So this is what in JavaScript is interesting, that all the data is kind of organized around at its root as objects, JavaScript objects. So objects are a huge part of how we reference and store data within JavaScript. But if you're familiar with any data structure that is a key value kind of model data structure, then it should be kind of familiar to you. But what might be unfamiliar to you is the fact that, you know, unlike certain other languages, because of the fact that JavaScript variables are not strongly typed, that object can have whatever type of data inside of it as key value pairs. Whereas in certain other languages, you create a dictionary that's like, the key is a string and the value is a Boolean, right? And it has to be, or else there's an error in the compiler, right? In JavaScript, it's like, hey, I created one object. That object has a number of different key value pairs, and those values can be whatever type of data, but the keys are just what I will use to reference that those values at different points in time. If you're still following along and this makes sense, just give me a thumbs up. I know JavaScript is hella confusing, but I'm just trying to show you some of the most important things that come up with it as you're as we're getting into the React space. So, you know, we're not really creating any objects right now, particularly ourselves, but what we see is going on inside of this particular file is that the React DOM, right, an object, is has a function on it called create root. That function is taking in some value as data, right? We're passing some data into that function, and that data actually is what gets returned from the document object model function, document get element by ID root. So if you remember, we ran this method in our original kind of JavaScript project with the tic-tac-toe. This will return an element in the HTML. And what the React DOM create root function does is take some element in the HTML document and creates that element as the root element of the React DOM. That element, this root DOM, this root that we created, right, this variable root, also as an object has particular methods and properties tied to it, where one of those things is another function called render, right? So clearly this is just another function being called render. And inside of that function, it takes in some components to render onto the screen. And that's what's going on here. So essentially, to just recap, we imported a component from another file. We created a root element on the HTML, and we rendered a component onto that particular root element by using some of the built-in methods that are built into React. Clearly, we didn't need to do anything. Create React app did this for us. But I think in looking at this, it kind of demonstrates some of that core JavaScript that you're going to need to be familiar with in order to understand and read through some of these files as we start building out some of the ones on our own. Michael, go ahead, bro.
Oh, thank you. So is it possible to have like multiple React DOMs in a single DOM? Like here, we just made it like in the root.
Yeah.
But what if we had like different React, like, I guess, components, you could say?
Yeah.
And then we can just drop them at various points in the DOM. Like,
yeah.
Oh, I want like this calculator thingy over here. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So that would go into, like we talked about, adding React to different to like existing HTML. Like so the thing is that you can do that, right? And there's a way for you to like basically insert React into different containers, for lack of better words, different root containers or whatnot. Those containers are then responsible for rendering the components that you write in JavaScript and React, right? So you can do that. Yeah, that's possible. When you're working with like a create React app project, we normally just create one root container, right? Like we're seeing here, and render all corresponding components inside of that container, right? Which is why I said the app becomes like kind of the component responsible for rendering our other components and whatnot. But if you weren't following kind of the create React app template and you wanted to create a website that had React inserted into different container elements, you could do that using some of these same functions, but specifying different containers.
All right, thank you. Because yeah, I was just trying to relate it to Angular, basically.
Oh yeah,
that is something you could. Because
Yeah.
like I use someone else's component, like a commercial off the shelf, and be like, oh, let me just grab this guy's work, throw it in here, and then this other guy's work, you know what I mean? And then you have a really nice page and you can really do nothing, you know.
Right.
So, all right, thank you, Professor.
No problem, bro. Yeah, and hopefully as we start talking about how the app JS and how we normally work with that, it will maybe make even more sense how you can achieve what you're talking about just with one component and not needing to create multiple routes. So that's something to be seen in the future. But yeah, y'all, so essentially big picture takeaways in terms of the JavaScript here, imports and exports and importing modules, as we call it, is really important. And so we'll be doing a lot of that, importing from one file into another file, as well as creating variables and creating objects that are going to be more sophisticated pieces of data that allow for us to pass data around, right? Pass functions and properties around for other files to use. And another big part of the React space, right, that's kind of unique to the JavaScript that we use within the React space is this idea of creating components. And we'll continue to talk about this because components in React are their own specific, have their own specific JavaScript syntax that we got to abide by in order to make those work. And to see that, we can go to the app.js now and talk a little bit more about what's going on in this file, right? So again, in terms of the JavaScript that we're seeing here, like after minimizing kind of that app component function, we're doing some imports, right? So clearly we're importing again from some other files inside of our project. Important to note with the imports that you always are going to import based on some path, right? If you're importing a specific file from your project, typically you're going to be importing it from a path inside of your project. And so it's important to note that the way that this path is created is relative to the file that you are looking at. So our app.js is inside of the source folder, right? And so this dot slash is saying, hey, inside of the current folder that I'm in, right? So inside of this folder that I'm in, I want logo.svg. And logo.svg, as you can see here, is a file that is also saved in our source folder, right? Because of that, by referencing it at this path, we can import it like so, and then bring it into this file. And using the import syntax where we say import, we give it some kind of keyword name, variable name to refer to it. The from says what is the path that we're importing it from, right? And that SVG file is here, and that SVG file is just some data, right? That's built for us to just kind of import as data for our project or for our logo, for the React logo. So we're importing it as a keyword logo, which, like I said, you could think about this as kind of like a variable name to refer to this particular bit of data that we can then use inside the project. So we'll see that that word logo and is used kind of inside of our project here. But then we're also importing another CSS file, which the CSS import is a little different than the regular imports, because with the CSS, you kind of just name it that you're importing it, and there's no like alias for it or any of that. You just kind of say, hey, I'm importing this path of file, right? So it's very kind of, it breaks those same conventions, whereas anything that is a JavaScript file or regular data, like an image file or any of that, you import it like this, import blank from blank. Whereas with CSS, you'll see it is just import the path of the CSS inside of this particular file. So imports, we talked about, I've mentioned briefly the corollary to imports is exporting. So in order to import JavaScript files into another JavaScript file, we need to export it. So you can export objects, you can export functions, right? And you can export any kind of data that you create using JavaScript, right? And those, the way that is structured is we create some JavaScript, right? Some JavaScript object Functions are by default, like a function in JavaScript is also treated as an object. That's why we can add functions into objects as data. So in this case, we created a function in JavaScript. So this, as some JavaScript data, can now be exported. Essentially, that's what's going on here. So we created the function, and now we're exporting it, and it gets imported inside of this other JavaScript file here. So the imports, exports definitely are something that come up quite a bunch. But as we're kind of going through it, I'll show you where it will apply to you. But I'm just kind of breaking down some of these core JavaScript concepts through the practical example of what the Create React App tool chain built for us. So we talked about the imports, we talked about the exports. So let's just focus now on this function, right? So clearly, in order for us to keep working in React, we're going to need to understand how to create functions and how to work with functions, right? And we're going to see a bunch of functions created for us. Components by default in React are created through functions. So we create a function that is responsible for returning the component's visual elements. And that is one of the reasons why the app.js that you see here is structured as a function, right? Is because we created some code. Its only responsibility is to return some visual elements for us inside of its return statement. Functions are like the simplest way for you to create a component in React. And a component in React is just essentially a object that holds the visual data that you want to put on your website. So this one component, this app component that we created, was responsible for rendering all of these visual elements. But as we start working on more, working on React in more sophisticated ways, you'll see that, we might be creating multiple components to make a project out the way that we expect it to be. The thing about this is that components themselves are you could think of as almost containers for the visual elements that you want to use. And we can pass components around into different files. And that's what we're seeing is going on within this index file, right? Where we imported the app and then we rendered it here. But itself, in and of itself is nothing but a function in JavaScript. And so just wanted to show you kind of the two ways to write functions. Clearly, you can do it like this with the old function keyword, and the function keyword is given to kind of mark something as a function. If you're particularly when we're doing components and creating new components in React, we name those components something with a capital letter, right? So almost think of it like in Java. Most of y'all I know use Java. You use classes, and in classes, it's typical that you start your classes with a capital letter, right? It's the same with components in React. Typically, you want to start those with a capital letter. And naming this component, right? We named it app. And this is just kind of the default function syntax for any function that you're writing in JavaScript. So if I wanted to write a function, to say hello, right? I could use the same syntax, and inside of here, write the logic that I want to put up there, right? So this is an example of another JavaScript function. Clearly, this one on line 24 to 26 is way less sophisticated as the one that we're building with React to create our components, but the premise and concept is the same. So that's my point, is to show you kind of that at the root of this complex stuff is very simple JavaScript stuff that makes it work. So there's two ways to write functions. One way is this function keyword way, where we kind of say function keyword, the name of the function, parentheses, to mark to mark basically any data that gets passed into the function, right? And then we create curly braces to be the scope of the function, the block of the function. And inside of those curly braces is whatever would happen when that function gets called. So if I wanted to call this function, right, I would do something like this. And when this function gets called, it will execute anything inside of these curly braces, right? So right now, the only thing that will happen is it's console log hello, right? So this is kind of how functions are structured in JavaScript. The second way that we see functions created, which is more of the modern way that folks are writing their functions, is to use what we call arrow syntax. So this way, I think we could say is like, let's say the old standard, right? But now we have kind of the modern standard, right? Which is using arrow functions to write that same function. So if I wanted to write this function with an arrow function, I'll say arrow function. The way we do that, we use those same variable keywords, right? So typically you'll either see them as let variables or, const, depending on what is going on with whoever's writing that function, if that function is going to be changed ever or whatnot. For me, I think it doesn't really matter too much, so I'll just say let. So let's say hello, right? And then to create this as a function, right? So basically it kind of looks like more like a variable assignment where we say, hey, I'm going to create this thing called say hello, and I'm going to set it equal to a function that looks something like this, right? So without using the function keyword, we can create another function that is doing the same thing, but with the modern standard syntax, which is an arrow syntax, right? So here, this is essentially creating the same thing, a function that is anything that's executed within these curly braces will be executed when it gets run. And so say hello, in this case, will just run this arrow function. There's some reasons why people value the arrow syntax more than the old standard syntax. Some of it comes up when we're working with passing that function around and it being able to know it's essentially where it was called. So sometimes you'll see folks using arrow syntax functions in JavaScript versus using kind of this function keyword syntax. Some folks are asking inside of the chat about the data types and stuff. And the thing about this is, again, like we talked about with variables in JavaScript, JavaScript functions don't mark a specific data type for returning. You can return whatever you want from a JavaScript file function. It defaults to void. So a JavaScript function will default to not returning anything. But if I wanted to return something from this function, I could just return, it, whatever that data is. So let's say instead of just console logging hello, maybe I want to create a variable called message or something. And I say message is equal to hello. And then it console logs it and then it returns the message, right? So nowhere in here do I have to say, let string say hello or whatever, right? In other programming languages, you have to be very specific with, hey, this is returning a string for this to work. But with JavaScript, you don't have to do that. You just have to write the function. So, to some people is great because you don't need to be so specific about your types. For other folks, and then in specific circumstances, the fact that you don't have this like strongly typed syntax can become an issue with debugging, right? You might expect this to return a string, but maybe this string isn't a string and it's returning a number, right? And now you're returning a number, right? So there's pros and cons to the fact that JavaScript is not a strongly typed language. Some folks argue that, hey, it helps you write just easier to read code. Other folks will say like, hey, that actually makes your code more prone to errors and bugs and stuff. So it really depends on how you hope to optimize what you're doing. So yeah, so folks are saying you have a console log with a return, like what's going on with this? So the console log is just another function. So basically this is just gonna run as its own, right? This just runs its own little function and then this returns, right? It would be different if I kind of did something like this where now this code is never going to get reached because this return happens before this function. So hopefully that makes sense to y'all. And I'm pretty sure VS Code, like you see, made this like different color to show you that this code is unreachable. I don't know how I can show you that. Oh yeah, it'll show you this now, right? So it's unreachable. So yeah, so that was the thing for the folks in the chat talking about that part. So these functions are clearly important, right? Writing functions in JavaScript is clearly something that's going to come up a lot. But in the context of what we're talking about with React, right, you might have functions in JavaScript that you write to do certain things in JavaScript for you, right? Do certain things like process some data and turn it into something else, return some data or whatever. But we also use functions to create the components that we're going to end up creating visually on our screen, right? And so this is kind of where it gets a little interesting, because here in this app function, right, we're just returning some data, right? It's just returning. So it's like, hey, here's a function called app, and then it just returns off rip, right? What it's returning is some interesting looking syntax stuff that looks like HTML, right? This stuff is what we call in the React space JSX. Whoops. And JSX is just a JavaScript syntax in React that we can use to basically write these like HTML-like elements in JavaScript. So I showed y'all this in the last session that, you know, when we highlight over these aren't HTML elements anymore. These are JSX elements. And so basically all the HTML elements have been within React, right, have been created as what we call JSX elements. So whatever HTML element you're thinking about, there's a JSX equivalent to that element, right? So we can use the JSX to write those HTML-like elements as JavaScript and return them in these JavaScript functions, right? So we talked about functions, right? Functions can return whatever. They don't have a type that says, hey, I got to return JSX or any of that. But the return statement is going to return some code, right? JavaScript is like, hey, whether you're returning a string, I don't care. Whether you're returning a Boolean, I don't care. Whether you're returning some JSX, I don't care. It's just going to be dependent on how you try to use it later, where it might not work, right? So if something's expecting this function to return a string and it doesn't return a string, now that function's it's that function's problem, right? So JavaScript's kind of like, hey, you know, it is what it is, you know what I'm saying? But where we expect that this app is returning JSX, it matters, right? So within the index.js, where we actually do care about what this app is doing, right? We're using this app in a React render statement, right? And the render takes React elements as the render state function here is expecting React components, right? And those React elements, right? If this app wasn't a React element, it would cause some problems here for us, right? So, I mean, we could almost just play with it. So I'm gonna comment out this app function real quick. Let's just create a new function for the app. So we say let app. Sometimes with components, I have seen a standard of people marking those as const arrow functions. So I'll just do that. So kind of keep y'all on your toes. So remember, any function that is going to be a component in React is supposed to return, it's supposed to return some JSX. So that's what the old function was doing. It was returning some JSX. But what happens if I return like 5? You know what I'm saying? Like, that's clearly not any JSX. It looks nothing like this HTML. It's none of that, right? It's just a number. So if I save this, right, in this index.js, it's still expecting it to be a component. So let's see what happens when I run this and it recompiles, the server recompiles. You know, we're gonna have some issues here. Or we might not, you know what I'm saying? Maybe it just puts 5 on the screen. We'll see. It would be interesting to see. Because technically that's text might still be considered HTML. So we'll see. Oh yeah, so that's kind of interesting, right? So it didn't break anything. It didn't like stop the server or do anything big dramatic like I expected, but it treated that 5 like a it treated that 5 that we created here as text. And then basically, if you remember in HTML, HTML can also take text as HTML. So it took that number 5 and essentially just rendered that on the screen. So still kind of worked, didn't do anything dramatic. Let's see, was there anything else that, let's see, what if we make it a Boolean? Let's see what happens. All right, well, there you go, right? It didn't render anything. So this is kind of interesting, right? Because the server didn't break. It's not like it's telling us like, oh, yes, you broke the React. So this is like what people will talk about with like the JavaScript typing thing, right? Clearly now our app has a bug in it, but if we didn't introduce that bug ourselves, we'd kind of be like, well, where did that come from? But the way that React is created is a declarative language. So, you know, it's essentially saying, hey, return this app component if we can return it. And if we can't return it, it just kind of is like, hey, you know, this app component isn't really returning anything. So it's rendering, but it's not rendering that particular component. Unlike other languages where you get a very specific error message that tells you, hey, you didn't render a component type. We expected type component, got nothing. We got type Boolean or something, right? We don't see that in JavaScript in this space. So it creates this interesting, interesting kind of scenario here where you want to be aware of like, what are the types of the things you're returning? And for that reason, right? That's why one of the reasons why a lot of developers from the JavaScript space who really cared about making the type declaration work easier to manage started using TypeScript. So you might have heard about TypeScript. Part of the reason why developers are liking it is because unlike pure JavaScript, TypeScript is very strongly typed. So you would have error messages that help you pinpoint issues like this faster. Folks are asking about like, so, you know, with JSX, you said we can return JSX and we returned it clearly in this app function that is a component. But what about in other functions? Like, what about like this say hello function? Can we return JSX there? And the answer is yes. So let's take a look at how that would work, right? So in this, let's just say, say hello is going to be a component, right? And we actually want to return some JSX. So anything that returns some JSX as a function, you can consider as a component. So y'all are kind of jumping a little ahead and saying, you know, like, can this other function do it? And yes, the answer is yes. So, you know, I can keep all this random stuff here, but instead of returning the message, right? What if I change this to just return, you know, a div, and inside of the div is hello, right? So say hello right now is returning this JSX, right? If I in the app component, if instead of returning true, right, just to kind of show you some more JavaScript stuff, right? I can return whatever the value of this function is, right? So think about it like if this function is returning something, and then I say, okay, return this, right? In the chat, what do y'all think the app is gonna do? I'll give you a second, and I'll take a second to drink some water while I have you. While I have you taking a second, I'll take a second for myself. Oh man. Yeah, so essentially, right, whatever this function is returning, right, we expect now that the app will return that, right? So if say hello returns this, well, our hope would be that returning this is basically saying, hey, run this function, say hello, and return whatever this function returns, right? So if we save this, then go back here. Whoops, I went all over the place, right? Now we got that div saying hello. It's not the most pretty, easy to see, but y'all get the picture, right? So clearly we're returning some other JSX outside of the, just, you know, the app.js has its own, but we returned it from a different function. And this is in essence how we use functions in React to Oh, my bad. Yo, it's saying my internet's unstable. If you can still hear me, give me a thumbs up just so I can make sure that that's okay. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it. I'm sorry. So the way we use functions in React is typically to do one of two things. One could just be to run some JavaScript function that returns some data into another function, like we were doing before with say hello. But the other thing is to return JSX. And when we return JSX, we can use that function as another component. So that is really kind of one of the things that makes React really interesting. So let's take a look at that, right? So I'm going to go back to the original app.js that the Create React App template made, right? So if y'all recall, this is the old template from the Create React App stuff. It has this div with a couple class names, you know, it has a bunch of other stuff, right? And let's say I want to add my component, the newer component, the say hello stuff into this existing bit of React code that we already had, right? Well, because this is a JavaScript file, I can do so many really interesting things because of the fact that this is JavaScript, right? So we're seeing some of it already, right? Remember, all this function is responsible for is returning JSX, right? But we can also, within this JSX, refer to JavaScript. And that's one of the things that makes React components so cool. And I guess a really important part of why would we do this versus do the HTML separate from the JavaScript route that we were doing before, right? So here, right, I have these elements, and let's say I want to add another element inside of this that is basically just our div that is saying hello, right? This little kind of say hello thing. I'm going to get rid of this message for now because it's not as important, but right now we have this div, it's saying hello, right? And let's say I want to have some of this element, this component element, to get put into our React app.js, right? So one thing to note is that within this app function, I could do all types of random functions here, you know, before I return, like kind of like, you know, I could console log like, yo, from the app, right? Right? I could add other functions here, you know, I could say, hey, you know what, name equal cam, right? Console.log name, right? So I could be doing JavaScript inside of the app function before I return, right? So long as it's before I return, all of this will still be valid JavaScript, right? But what gets tricky is that now that I'm kind of returning JSX, as you'll see, it's not as easy to then add those JavaScript things immediately into the return statement, right? We get some errors now that's talking about how now this code like is undetected. Like, it's very interesting, right? So if you're returning JSX, everything you return has to be JSX. If you start trying to return other JavaScript lines or things, that return doesn't actually work with returning JSX into your component. So typically you have to make that decision. Am I returning JSX or am I going to return just regular JavaScript, right? So to get around this, right, we can still use JavaScript within this return statement. We just have to use curly braces to refer to that JavaScript. So what you'll see is typically, like when folks are referring to a JavaScript function or something inside of their JSX, is using curly braces to refer to that JavaScript, right? So here I open some curly braces and we have a function called say hello, right? So if I call this function say hello, right? Essentially we're saying, hey, run this JavaScript function. And then essentially what this curly brace is saying is like, take that object and put it into a format of like something that would be able to be processed as JSX here. Like that's a more complicated way to explain it, but that's essentially what we're saying is with any curly brace that you see within the JSX block of code, basically inside of that curly brace, you can run some JavaScript. I think that's a better way to explain what I'm trying to say, right? So in order to run this function, I have to wrap it in these curly braces. And doing this, right? By doing this, if I save this now and go back to once it compiles, right? Go back here. So clearly we got all that JSX that we had before, and we have this hello element getting rendered as well, right? So by referencing this function that has JSX inside of it, we're able to pass JSX into other JSX elements by way of using this function, right? And so if you can imagine now, like, what if this say hello function was a little bit more robust than just, one div that says hello, right? Like, let's say, this function had a little bit more intrigue to it, right? And so maybe it's a div, but inside of the div, this is a H1, or maybe, let's say like H3 to be a little less dramatic, right? Close it. And then maybe I'll put a little paragraph here and just say something like, we're rendering this from another function. Or let's say we're writing this from another function, to be more specific, right? So now this say hello function is returning a couple more sophisticated, a little bit more sophisticated elements. But as you can see, all of those elements are still being rendered inside of the app, right? So the app.js is still being kind of the main component, but we're saying, hey, render this also, render this JavaScript that is here. And so long as whatever is returned here is can be like, HTML-like element, it can be rendered on the screen. So remember when we had it as a Boolean, right? When I just kind of had to say true, it didn't render anything because true isn't actually HTML. Like a Boolean isn't HTML. It can't be HTML, but strings, numbers, those things can be, right? Like we can see strings and numbers in HTML. And clearly this JSX is like HTML-like elements, right? So our expectation would be that these types of elements would be rendered on the screen as well. What we've done here in essence is create another component. Whenever we create another function that is responsible for returning JSX, we're creating another component. So we just created our second component. It's called say hello, right? Typically, like I told you, we like to give those components names that are start with a capital letter. So I'm just gonna rename this to hello, and then inside of here, clearly because I've renamed that function, I gotta rename it like this, right? But one step further is when you are rendering another component, right? So basically, like I said, a component is just another bit of another function returning JSX. When you're rendering another component, there's two ways you can render it. You could do it like this, like we just did, where we have curly braces and that function is being called. The second way is to refer to that component as another JSX element. So if I run hello like this, right? Oops. Right? If I run hello like this, right? So this looks like its own HTML-like element, but clearly there's no HTML element called hello, right? What I'm doing here is rendering this component. This is a new component that we've created. And this component, the JavaScript knows, okay, hello is its own component. Clearly, this isn't just regular HTML. This isn't like a paragraph. This isn't like an image. This is its own component. And that component, it will expect to be defined somewhere, right? Luckily, we put this component inside of our same file. So inside of this file is another variable another JavaScript data called hello, right? And that is that's returning some JSX, right? This component now, right, with this syntax that we just changed it to, if I save this, right, we're gonna still see the same thing in here. whoops, my bad. Where did I gotta change this? Hello. Oh, my bad. I gotta get rid of this. I'm gonna add this so we can see it say something different. I'm gonna just add another paragraph and just say, we created a new component called hello. Right, so I saved this, the compile should be successful now. And there we go, right? So now we're adding some more some more visual elements to our React app.js component itself, right? And so essentially what we're doing now is we just covered the same topic, but we're seeing it in a different way. So let's back up and start and just talk about it one more time, right? So remember, all React components are doing are declaring some function, and that function is returning JSX, right? JSX are like these JavaScript, HTML-like elements that are responsible for showing visual elements, right? The app.js was doing some, and what we did was we created our own function, right? So remember, now hello is a function, right? And that function is returning also some JSX, just some different JSX, right? Well, all we did that's I guess different is we called, at first I showed you how we call functions, right? We call functions like this, just like this, right? But in order to call a function in the JSX, right? Remember that, like, if the app is a component, the return statement would say, what is it going to show, right? The return would be the visual stuff we expect it to show. So technically, I need whatever I want to show to be inside of this return statement. I can't just call hello here because now it changes the type of, basically I can't return both JavaScript expressions and JSX. I have to choose one of the other. So I want this to return JSX. So I need to call that JavaScript inside of the JSX. And basically there's two ways to call JavaScript inside of the JSX. If you're just calling a JavaScript variable, like let's say, I'll show you that in a second. Like let's say here, right? I created a new variable, let's call it name, right? And I set that name to be my name as a string or something, right? If I wanted to refer to this variable inside of this JSX, right? I could do that with passing the JavaScript, right? And to pass the JavaScript, again, I just need to use the curly braces. So paragraphs, as you remember, are elements that pass text. So if I have a variable that's a string, right? I can pass that into my variable here as I can pass that into this paragraph here by using these curly braces to refer to the JavaScript. So I could say something like, whoops, my bad, caps lock. I'm clearly excited. So something like this, right? Where I say, yo, name is hacking in React, right? So this now is basically trying to make reference to this variable name that I created here, right? So if I save this, right, you see that this got turned into my name Cam as data, right? So I can pass JavaScript data into these different elements by using these curly braces. That's what I was trying to tell y'all earlier. Is like the curly braces basically is just like you could pass some JavaScript here. This JavaScript just so happens to just be a variable. If this was a function like we saw before, right? I could do the same thing where I could say, hey, you know, I want to run a function that's going to return some JSX and just do something like this, right? But the curly braces is how I can pass JavaScript into the JSX. So we did this originally at first, right? Or well, now it would be called hello, like this, right? But what I'm trying to say is that when we're writing components specifically, so when you know that, hey, you know, it's not just a variable, it's actually like a bigger component that I might want to put in other places, typically you'll see it not written out like this, like just with the old function syntax. You'd see it written out as an actual kind of element like this with a self-closing tag in this regard, right? So so delete this. So that's what happened, right? So we created another component and we're rendering it here. But the JavaScript allows us to pass data into these visual elements, whether as data for it to render, or in the case of the image, right, we're passing it as data for its attributes to use, right? So this is what I meant when I said that this makes it so that we can kind of combine the value of the HTML, which is to show these visual elements, with the like dynamicism of the programming language of JavaScript, which allows us to then be a little bit more to use those JavaScript, the functionality of the JavaScript programming language in our in these unique ways, right? Like I can create variables, I create functions and call functions, right? I can do conditionals, and maybe next time I'll show you like how we can do conditional stuff in here, right? So all of that is possible because this is a JavaScript file, and this is technically just JavaScript data that we're talking about. I couldn't do this level of like inserting data and stuff just off a HTML file alone, which is one of the things that made using React in these libraries so popular. So yeah, any function that you create that you want to run in your JSX, you can run it with those function keyword, with like the name of the function, like so, right? Passing that to be called. So sometimes you'll see people rendering things and you'll see a function being passed like this. But if the function itself is all it's doing is returning some JSX, you'll see it sometimes more often than not written out as a component like this. And more than that, right, to kind of go back to everything we talked about before, typically you don't want to see, you're not going to see a bunch of components all in one file because that just gets cluttered and it makes things a little harder to read. So what you'll see people do is take the functional components that they're creating and create and save them in other files, right? So I have this folder called components that I created last session. So I might create a new file, and inside of that file, I'll call it hello.js. So it needs to have a .js so it knows that it's a JavaScript file, right? But I named it with the capital H hello to show that this is its own component. This is going to be its own component. So we typically give components their own capital letter name. And here I could just paste this thing we had before, right? So this is just a function that's returning some JSX, right? The only thing I have to do now to make sure that this can be called from that other file is to export it, right? So I could say export default hello, right? So this will basically say export this as data that now can be passed inside of that can be imported in another file. So here I could say import hello from, right? And so now hello is in its own, it's just in a different folder called components. So I'm gonna have to do dot, right? / we'll say anything within the source folder. Clearly it's in the components and I want the hello file. So you don't have to say hello.js. You could if you want to, but it will know just from this import that you're importing a JavaScript file. So the .js is not necessary. But here now I'm saying import hello, which is this component we just created, right? It's in its own file, right? Import that here. And now I can make use of it like this, right? So now if I save this, everything should work as expected. As a matter of fact, I'm gonna add one more thing here to just show that this is in its own file. So not only did we write this from another function, not only did we create a new component called hello, this is being saved in its own file. Right, and so I would just expect that that would be here as well to just make sure, okay, cool, everything's rendering as I expect it to, and we're continuously adding these visual elements onto the screen, right? Even though this is in its own file, right? We can import it and render it from our app.js, right? So because the React people had all this stuff there as the default, I kind of just added it here as its own component. But if I didn't want all the stuff that the React people did, right, I could just theoretically return our component that we made, right? So long as this is returning something that turns into JSX, we're good. So if I just say return hello, then I would expect this to render with just our stuff, right? So here's all of the components from the hello component that we created now being rendered on our screen. And it's nothing more than just another function and returning this JSX, right? There's nothing more complex than that, and just deciding what are the JSX that I want to see and then exporting it so I can import it here in the app to return as its own bit of data as well. And yeah, and that is essentially it in terms of all the JavaScript related to like these first wave things to know with React. Of course, you know, once you start getting into more, there's other aspects of the JavaScript programming language we haven't touched on, things like using arrays and how we can manage data with arrays and things of that nature, which we'll talk about. But I would say at base, like if you can understand these core JavaScript concepts of imports and exports, writing functions, and you know, saving data as creating data that then you return in your functions, then you basically understand the basics of JavaScript that you need to know in order to really follow along with learning React. Everything else is new kind of conceptual stuff related to how do you do XYZ in JavaScript to do your needs and suit your needs, which you'll learn over time. But at core, right, to create components, this is all we got to do. And React is built off of components. So long as you can create components with JSX inside of them, you'll understand how the rest of React is going to be created. And if you understand these concepts of variables and a little bit of what we talked about with objects earlier, everything else will make a lot of sense as we kind of get more into the some more of the more complex things in the React library. So I think this is a great place to pause. I appreciate y'all for your time and attention. If you have a question, feel free